This slideshow will explore the story of a Victorian naturalist, Charles Darwin. His explanation of how more complex living things developed from simple ones. How Darwin's ideas have been built upon over the last 200 years, and the evidence we now have to support his ideas. The world today is home to a huge diversity of living species. Some scientists think there may be nearly 10 million, many of which we have not discovered yet. Less than 200 years ago, most people, including scientists, thought that every type of organism had been designed and created by God. In the 1800s, it took someone very brave to question that view. Charles Darwin. Aged 22, Darwin travelled on a ship called the Beagle to the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean. Here he saw similar finches on the different islands, but with beaks that were adapted to the predominant food on that island. Darwin reasoned that at one time all the birds were the same species, probably blown from the mainland to the islands in a storm. He suggested that the birds that had better adapted beaks for feeding on each island were more likely to survive, to breed, and pass on their features to their offspring. In this way, small changes will be magnified and eventually lead to the formation of different species. He called this natural selection. Darwin noted several conditions which were causing species to evolve by natural selection. There is variation in most populations. Most organisms produce excess offspring, so some will survive to be adults. Because population sizes remain relatively stable, there must be a struggle for life. Some organisms are better adapted, so more likely to survive, often called survival of the fittest. Better adapted organisms are more likely to reproduce and pass on their adaptations to their offspring. When the first 5 things repeat many times, new species will arise. This process is a very elegant one. In The Origin of Species, Darwin himself wrote, "There is grandeur in this view of life." Around the time he visited the Galapagos, Darwin read a book called Principle of Geology by Charles Lyell, a leading geologist of the time. Lyell proposed that geological processes are uniform and their rates remain constant. For example, that the rate at which mountains are made is balanced over long periods of time by their erosion. It is thought that this, together with his findings from the Galapagos, may have caused Darwin to first doubt the view held by the Church, that the Earth was only a few thousand years old and static. Darwin was so aware of how controversial his theory was that he was reluctant to publish it. He gave a copy of it to his wife and told her only to publish it when he was dead. Only when another scientist, called Wallace, actually wrote to Darwin asking him to check his theory, which was the same as Darwin's, did Darwin rush to finish his book first. When he did publish his book, many church leaders were not convinced or impressed. Shortly afterwards, in an important debate, a scientist called Huxley stood up for Darwin. The Bishop of Oxford asked him whether it was his grandmother or grandfather that was descended from a monkey. Fossils are the remains or imprints of living organisms from millions of years ago. They are found in sedimentary rock. The fossil record shows how some organisms have adapted over time. Ammonites were aquatic mollusks that had external shells, and changes in them are often used as an example of evidence for evolution. The times that the organisms were alive are determined by radioactive dating. There are limitations with the fossil record as evidence for evolution, though. The number of species in the fossil record is only about 5% of the known living species. And there are large gaps in the record where big jumps in evolution are seen. This disagrees with Darwin's more gradual observable change. However, we know that not all living tissue fossilizes. Fossils are only found in sedimentary rock, and many fossils have not yet been discovered. Further evidence for evolution is seen in the similarity of organisms' morphology. The study of this is called comparative anatomy. A famous example of this is the pentadactyl limb. All classes of tetrapods, vertebrates with 4 legs, including mammals and amphibians, possess the pentadactyl limb. This is a pattern of limb bones containing 1 proximal bone, 2 distal bones, 7 carpals, 5 metacarpals, and many phalanges. Different tetrapods have different arrangements of these bones. These homologous structures suggest a common ancestral forelimb has evolved into different forms. Monkeys have longer forearms to swing through trees. Horses have a much longer third metacarpal, which has a hoof. Bat wings are made from 4 long metacarpals, the 5th of which they use to hang upside down. The peppered moth population before the Industrial Revolution, 1750 to 1850, was mainly light-coloured, for the trees in which they lived mainly had light-coloured bark. The pollution produced from the factories turned the bark of many trees black. This meant that the small population of black moths now had the evolutionary advantage, and their population grew in number. This example shows us 2 important points about evolution. Firstly, it can only be measured by the relative changes in populations of organisms possessing certain characteristics. Secondly, evolutionary changes occur in specific locations at certain times when conditions change. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria, MRSA, provide more recent evidence for evolution. Antibiotics were only discovered in the early 1900s by Alexander Fleming. Their increased usage ever since has resulted in an evolutionary advantage for those that are resistant to the drug, which are now growing more rapidly. Some doctors think that soon bacteria will be resistant to all antibiotics, and we will then need another solution to bacterial and fungal infections. Other pathogens, including HIV and tuberculosis, also provide evidence for evolution. Doctors say they are in an evolutionary race with their hosts, us. They possess sophisticated evasion mechanisms so that our immune system is unable to recognize and destroy them. This type of pathogen may have evolved to avoid our defenses. Closely related organisms go through very similar stages in the development of their embryos. The study of this is called comparative embryology. This also provides evidence for evolution. All vertebrate embryos go through an early stage in which they all have gill pouches on the sides of their necks. At this point, the embryos of fish, frogs, snakes, birds, and humans have more similarities than they do differences. As the embryos develop, the differences do increase. Fish develop gills, whereas terrestrial vertebrates develop modified structures, like eustachian tubes. Mitochondrial DNA is present in the mitochondria of plant and animal cells. It is passed from mother to child, never from a father. Scientists have traced back human mitochondrial DNA to a common ancestor called African Eve, who lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa. Mitochondrial DNA is a good source of evidence for human evolution because it has high mutation rates, meaning it is relatively easy to make a DNA family tree. It does not degrade over time and is found in high levels in cells. Genes tell cells how to make proteins. Enzymes are an example of proteins. So, by comparing an enzyme that has the same function in different species, we know how similar their genes are. Similar enzymes mean similar genes, and similar genes means they are closely related. Trees of similarity have been produced for lots of molecules from lots of organisms. These new trees match the trees that were made by looking at the similarities between fossils and skeletons, so provide further evidence for evolution. This study is called comparative biochemistry. Since Darwin, scientific evidence overwhelmingly agrees that evolution by natural selection is responsible for the huge diversity of living things. A survey of over 2,000 statistically representative people in 2009 found that half of British adults do not believe in evolution.